Hey guys, all right, so today we're going to talk about the age of Porfirio Diaz, El Macho, 1876 to 1910, the great dictator of Mexico. If you recall when we left off in the video lecture on the La Reforma, Benito Juarez and La Reforma, the very end of that, we talked about how Porfirio Diaz had issued the plan of Tuxtepec and basically threw Miguel Lerdo out of the country, kicked him out of the country, and essentially taken over the government and brought the restored republic to an end and all that sort of thing. That's kind of where we closed that lecture out. So now let's pick up here at this point and talk about the Porfiriato, or the age of Porfirio Diaz, okay, which is going to run for 35 years, right? He did not arrive in power as most dictators do, with fire and brimstone, blood and thunder. Rather, he made friends of enemies, and he behaved with remarkable equanimity and grace in those early years. He also acted from the very beginning like a man with a plan, putting the pieces of the Porfiriato in place. Diaz served out the 4 years of the presidential term from 1876 to 1880, and then he chose not to run for re-election in accordance with his own plan of Tuxtepec, which was effective suffrage, meaning all citizens should have the right to vote, those that were qualified according to the letter of the law, which were men of a certain age and property qualifications and so on and so forth. And the plan of Tuxtepec also said no re-election. Okay? So he's not running for re-election. Instead, he chose to run for the governorship of his home state of Oaxaca, and then for the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But he sponsored, he got behind a guy in 1880, a close associate, Manuel Gonzalez, a former general, like himself, a military man, and a man who fit in Diaz's hand as the perfect tool fits within the grasp of a master carpenter. In other words, from 1881 through 1884, Diaz was president in all but name, because the only important decisions that were made by Gonzalez were those decisions that were made by Diaz first. Okay, in other words, Diaz was basically president for those 4 years because Gonzalez was his tool, or like a puppet dancing on the strings that Diaz was controlling. And many, many important decisions were made during those 4 years, such as enormous tracts, huge tracts of vacant land were sold to hacendados and foreign investors. Much of this land was occupied by Indians who had been displaced by the Ley Lerdo in the 1850s. In addition, railroad and mining concessions were sold in large numbers to foreign investors, especially in the northern states, and particularly to Americans. Diaz knew that if the United States was not kept happy, then they might force their happiness with guns. And he thought, better to have the Americans as friends than enemies. He also understood that the United States was logically Mexico's #1 trading partner, and railroad connections between them was a must, between Mexico and the United States. He was nothing if not a realist. You may remember from the previous lecture that Lerdo thought that the United States and Mexico should be kept apart, that there should be no railway connections between them. He had that great quote where he said, "Let there be a desert between strength and weakness." Diaz is like, what a nitwit, I mean, obviously the Americans are right next door to us. If they want to conquer us or something or steal more of our land, we're never going to be strong enough to keep them out or fight them off, or they're logically our #1 trade partner. Let's build up as many connections with them if we can. It's going to be good for our economy. It's going to be good for us in every possible way. So selling off railway concessions, selling off mining concessions, but for the first time, it wasn't just the right to operate on the land that is being sold. It was the actual ownership of what lay beneath the land, or the subsoil. Sub meaning beneath, like subterranean, submarine. Okay, so the subsoil rights are being auctioned off. Historically, these rights had always belonged to the crown, the Spanish crown in the colonial era, or later the national government. But Diaz knew that to get maximum value, the big bucks, okay, that this had to be part of the package, and so they went. He saw this as selling the nation through necessity. Many amongst the Mexican elite, pardon me, especially the liberals, were aghast at these deals, and by 1884, they were begging Diaz to run for the presidency in spite of his no re-election position, right? The plan of Tuxtepec. The nation needed him to save them from Gonzalez's mistakes. This, of course, had been part of his plan all along, to become Mexico's indispensable man. In other words, he used Gonzalez as a stalking horse, as a mask, to sort of do all these things that he wanted to have done, but to get them done without him having to be the guy that was doing it, okay? And then, when all these things were done, or getting done, and everybody got upset over it, and then they came to him saying, you're the only one that can sort of fix this, or save us, or stop Gonzalez, you know, he would be the guy that they had to turn to, that, you know, Superman, right? El Macho to come in and save the day. So in 1884, they say, look, no election, plan of Tuxtepec, who cares? You've got to be the guy. Run for re-election in 1884. Forget about all that. So in 1884, Diaz is able to contravene or you know, basically compromise his own plan of Tuxtepec and no re-election and run for the presidency and come back to power, right? Okay, now if you look at this image up here, it shows you, you know, the pace of railway construction in Mexico. You know, before the 1890s, you've got these red lines, and then in the 1890s, you get these green lines added in, and then in 1900 to 1912, the red dotted lines are added, and then the green dotted lines, you know, later on. You can see the slow but steady growth of the railway network in Mexico, okay, over the course of, what is it, you know, 70, 80 years or so. Okay, now, Diaz, pardon me for just a second, Diaz constructed a political system where every man of power owed their position and power to him. Every judge and important bureaucratic position was a man selected by him personally. Several hundred mayors, every state governor got into office after passing under his watchful eye. Every region had a military commander, and Diaz played these men against the governors in that area so that no one powerful man could build up a base of power that might challenge his own. If a military leader appeared too ambitious, Diaz promoted them out of the military and into a political position, and then at the other end of the country, so that they were you know, moved off to a different area where they didn't know anybody. Okay, he was like a master chess player, you know, moving the pieces around the board, just knowing exactly where to put people and where to, you know, get people out of the place where they were going to create a problem for him. He established a peacekeeping organization for the enormous rural regions of Mexico, the Guardias Rurales, or the guardians of the countryside. Their job was to make the roads and the highways of Mexico safe for travelers and to keep peace in the small towns and the villages. They proved far more effective at hunting down and killing bandits than the army, especially with their employment of the notorious Ley de la Fuga, or the law of the fugitive. This was a law which simply meant shoot first, ask questions later, as it was considered better to save good blood by shooting bad. Okay, and the other thing that was great is in the early, couple of years of sort of going after these bandit gangs, these highway robbers that out in the rural areas. Diaz told his guys, the Guardias Reales, to capture them. Okay, catch as many of them as you can, bring them back to Mexico City. So these guys would be brought back to Mexico City, taken into the basement of this building, this government building, and sort of, put down in there. You guys have all seen like cop shows, dudes get thrown into some room with a mirror on the wall and a table and a couple of chairs, left there for 2, 3, 4 hours, nothing to drink, nothing to eat. They don't know what's going to happen, right? Okay. And then in walks Porfirio Diaz, okay? $1,000 suit with a nice chalk stripe and a handkerchief and whatever, and they recognize him. Like they go, shit, man, that's a president. Holy, what the hell, right? And so Diaz comes in and he sits down, takes out a thing of cigars, offers them around, lights everybody up. Everybody's puffing away. These guys are all looking at each other like, like, what's going on here, man? Like, And so after a while, couple of minutes, they're getting more and more nervous because they don't know what's going on now, right? Diaz says to these guys, so, gentlemen, how many fingers do you want? And they're looking at each other, and they're all thinking the same thing. These are not the sharpest guys in the world, and they're thinking, man, I was never good at riddles, right? Like, what's he talking about? How many fingers do I want? And so sooner or later, one of them would be bold enough to say, Senor Presidente, what do you mean? How many fingers? And he said, do you want 1 finger from me or 5? So now they're all going like, 1 finger or 5? What does it mean, 1 finger or 5? He says, do you want 5 fingers in friendship? And he put out his hand like, do you want to shake my hand? Or do you want 1 finger? In other words, do you want to die today, maybe in this room? Or do you want to take my hand? So they figured out pretty quick. They don't know what the friendship part means, but they do know what the gun means, right? So, yeah, we want to be buddies, right? Amigo, right? Okay, so what the friendship thing means is this. Do you want to come to work for me? Do you want to join the Guardias Reales? See, Diaz was a kind of genius. He says, look, if I'm going to create a police force for the countryside, who knows the countryside better than the banditos that have been robbing the countryside, preying upon the countryside, right? He captured the bad guys and then turned them into the police force for the countryside, okay? Yeah, this is like taking the Crips and the Bloods, the scariest gangs in LA, okay, and then turning them into the police. Right? Okay, I mean, very effective, but who wants to be like the villagers and the townspeople, the campesinos of the countryside, when the bad guys that used to prey upon you are now still preying upon you, but now they have the law on their side. They have the government behind them. Okay? Diaz's orders are very specific. Keep the countryside under control, but protect people traveling on the highways. Make sure that people from other countries, foreigners, you never hurt them, you never molest them, you take care of them like you're their own mothers, because he wanted those sort of people to think well of Mexico, to go back to their other countries, to tell other people outside of Mexico, Mexico is the safest place in the world, Mexico's the greatest country in the world. This Porfirio Diaz has really, whipped things together and gotten that country straightened out and so on and so forth. Like, this guy, he was very sharp about the way he, straightened the country out. But, okay, now, under Diaz, the last independent Indian tribes are pacified. The Maya in Quintana Roo in the south, and the Yaqui in Sonora and Chihuahua in the north. The lands thus opened up, it was hoped, would lead to an influx of European immigration in the same way that the opening up of the American plains had brought in millions of European immigrants. But the discovery of great deposits of mineral wealth, copper and silver, put that all to rest. Instead, in came the great foreign capitalist enterprises, big investors, and the sale of vast holdings and the subsoil rights rolled forward yet again. Where the minerals were lacking, The hacendados bought the land as before, and their plantations and herds of livestock grew greater than ever. American, French, German, and British entrepreneurs reconstructed the economy with their capital, innovations, and technology, but when they were done, it was, in a sense, the same economy it had been during the colonial era. Great mines and plantations, but there was more of it, and everything ran much more efficiently and by way of railroads. There was almost no manufacturing except in the small industries of ceramics and cotton and tobacco goods. Now compare that to what's happening in the United States very soon with things like, radios, refrigerators, electronics, clocks, guns, okay, farm equipment, tools, sewing machines, right? Mexico is way behind, okay? Now, by the end of the century, at least half of all the land in Mexico belonged to less than 10,000 families and foreign companies, and at least 1 million families had lost their land and been displaced. At least 1 million families. Reduced to a status of debt peonage, they owed so much money to the hacendados that they were forbidden under any circumstances to even leave the hacienda until their debt was paid. And it could never be paid, not in their lifetime. They owed too much money. They could never pay it off. They'd never earn enough money ever to pay it off. And their children would inherit their debt. Some historians have estimated that 1/3 of the population of the country had reached this state by 1910. They had become pelados. A pelado was a peeled one. It was a reference that meant that, like an onion, they had been peeled. Like an onion, you take one skin off and another skin and another skin, another layer, another layer, another layer, until it had just become this little interior ball. Like, in other words, everything had been peeled off or taken away from these people until all that was left was the tiniest inner essence of them. The population was about 15 million, and several million people literally had nothing to do every day, all day, from the moment they woke up till the moment they closed their eyes. They had nothing to do. They could just sit in one spot and slowly but surely starve to death because there was nothing for them to do. There was nothing for them to be employed at. They had nowhere to go at the turn of the century. That was how backward the economy was. Agriculture could have employed all of these people, but the majority of the lands that could have been cultivated were left unused due to laziness and inefficiency. Mexico, which along with Mesopotamia had been first in all of the world to develop agriculture, for the first time in thousands of years could not produce enough food to feed its people because land that had grown corn, beans, and squash had been turned to the cultivation of maguey and agave to feed its booming tequila and pulque industries. Alcohol for export was deemed much sexier and made Mexico look better around the world than boring old cornmeal and beans. So the Cientificos said, and we'll get to them in a minute, fully 60% of the population drank more than a liter of pulque daily, never drunk but stupefied, numbed to their condition in life, reinforcing to those above them that the Indios and mixed bloods were incompetent. In 1900, the average man earned 25% in wages, what he would have earned in 1800. Think about that. 100 years ago in the United States, what did the average working man make in an hour? Well, I'm not sure what he made an hour, but the average working man in a year made about $1,600 a year. Okay. Now, what does the average man make now in a year? 30 grand? Something like that? $35,000? Okay. So in 1900, the average man earned 25% of what he earned in 1800. In 1800, if the average man made $100 a year, in 1900 he made $25 a year. Okay, It's going backwards in a dramatic way. Like, unbelievable, right? And here you got this fantastic painting by Jorge Gonzalez Camarena called Genesis, showing, like, you know, the Adam and Eve of Mexico making their first home inside of a corn cob, right? Inside of an ear of corn, not a cob, but an ear of corn, right? The idea being that corn is what provided everything for Mexico. It's what gave birth to ancient Mexican civilization, the ancient Indian civilizations of Mexico. But now Mexico can't even feed itself because the Porfiriato has effed everything up so badly in terms of the agricultural base of the country. It's unbelievable. Okay, the psychosis of the Cientificos. La Reforma, try as it might, had not destroyed the Mexican upper class. There was a growth of smallholders, meaning small landholders, and native Mexican businessmen, but the lands lost by the church and the Indian ejidos were, for the most part, purchased by hacendados and consolidated, as mentioned previously in the lecture on La Reforma, into larger and larger land holdings, into haciendas bigger than anything anyone had ever dreamt of previously. Excuse me one sec, guys. Sorry, space heater is killing me. Even as the Indians were losing more and more of their patrimony, the leaders of Mexico raised statues to Cuauhtemoc and Moctezuma, but this was little more than a kind of lip service. It was impossible to venerate the Spanish, who were become little more than an afterthought on the map of Europe. And so the great model for Mexico became the leader of the Latin world and their recent political bedfellow, France. French novels were in vogue, as were French philosophers, and the children of the elites were sent to French schools. The homes of Mexicans with money were filled up with all of the things of France. And so the heads of Mexican elites and the men who advised Porfirio Diaz were likewise filled up with all things France, right? Vive la France! In particular, a philosophy, positivism, which, in a nutshell, argued that society operates according to natural laws, and so, with the right amount of rational thought, any problem or set of problems can be resolved through the simple application of logic. This is something that Mr. Spock from Star Trek could really get behind, right? Now, the danger inherent in this philosophical approach is that any group of intelligent men can thus convince themselves that their solution to a given problem must be the correct one because they, a group of intelligent men, came up with it, right? Okay, but let's not get into that. Just, think about that as we go along here. So Diaz's primary advisors were a group of men known as the Cientificos, or the scientists, a brainy cabal whose particular positivist ideological perspective centered on the belief that capitalism, free market economics, could fix everything. The Cientificos decided that there were two things that set Mexico apart from France. Only two, mind you. There's only two things that make us different from France. And if only these two things could be changed, then there was no reason that Mexico should not follow the path to capitalist greatness that France had followed in recent centuries. These problems were, it had Indians, and far too many of them. And while it had a middle class, the middle class was too small. These Cientificos had studied enough history to know that the single thing that had been most essential to the development of the economies of the leading nations of the West England, jolly good. Come, right? British Empire and all that. Germany. Yeah, it's the Germans. It's the great nation of Germany. And the French. We've just been talking about them. Yeah, the Netherlands. It was the growth in those countries starting in the 1400s of the middle class. And even just recently, in the last 100 or so years, the United States, you could even put them into the group, okay? But so, gee, Dave, why is the middle class so important historically? I hear you asking yourselves. A couple of you might be history majors and you already know this, but I'm sure that most of you are going, what's so great about the middle class? Like, that's the most important thing? The single most important thing that led to the greatness of those nations? And yeah, the single most important thing. Okay? So, the middle class has been the engine of excellence for every truly modern nation, the Cientificos told Diaz, and Mexico must have a vibrant, dynamic middle class. Okay? In order to foster the growth of this group, we must build within our great cities, Mexico City, Veracruz, Guadalajara, San Luis Potosi, Guanajuato, etc. We have to build universities, libraries, museums, the institutions that help to develop the minds and abilities of middle-class citizens. Okay? But what they couldn't see, the Cientificos, or what they refused to accept, we can never really know what was going on in their heads, okay, was that a middle class has to develop organically over decades, generations, centuries even, okay? They have to learn along the way certain historical lessons and evolve along with their society. You can't simply whip up a thriving middle class like a flan, with like some recipe in a matter of years or decades. You can't just invent it, in like a generation or a lifetime. But wait, let's stop for a minute. I didn't answer my own question. What's so important about the middle class? You're all going, come on, stupid, you posed a question. Answer the damn question, right? Okay. There's two reasons why the middle class is the engine of greatness in the rise to power of the leading nations of the West, or in the rise to power of any nation in modern history, okay? But Germany, France, England, the Netherlands, the United States, in particular Canada, and then in recent history, in the last half century or so, nations like China, Brazil, India, okay, or Japan, since World War II. But okay, two things. Number one, the middle class, they educated their children. Okay, they placed a premium importance on getting their kids educated. And the second thing is they saved up money for the future. When you put those two things together, the idea being that the next generation is going to have it better than we are. My kids are going to do better than me. Our kids, me and my wife, our kids are going to be better than us. And their kids are going to do better than them. And their kids are going to do better. Think about it, guys. Doesn't that almost sound like a simple formulation or statement of the American dream? That each generation climbs another rung up the ladder, does better than the previous generation. Isn't that the idea of the American dream? Okay, well, before it was the American dream, it was the middle class dream. Okay, the lower class, historically, going back to the 14, 15, 1600s, they simply never made enough money to save for the future or to educate their kids. But the middle class did. And slowly but surely, the middle class got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they helped to uplift the upper lower class to create a bigger lower middle class. And so it expanded and grew and improved society in all kinds of ways. We can't get into all this here. But trust me, guys, The middle class is the engine of greatness. If you guys have been paying attention at all to what has been talked about in the last couple of years, especially with this recent election cycle, okay? And I'm filming this video lecture about 2 weeks after Donald Trump actually became president, started his presidency. I don't know when you're going to be watching this, in a year, 2, 3, and 4 years. So basically, if you've been paying attention to the news in 2016, 15, 14, 13, what is it? One of the biggest topics of debate, the shrinking American middle class and why that's so bad for the country. It's bad. Get out of here. What is this? Get out. Get out of here. Really bad for the country, guys. Because part of what made America great, the United States great, is that our middle class, for well over 100 years, from the 19th century into the 20th century, got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But now in the late 20th century, right towards the end and into the 21st century, it's shrinking. Bad. Okay? All right. Back into the lecture. So, okay. What about the Indian problem, the second problem that Cientificos said made Mexico different from France? Well, we've talked about that. Force them off their lands and onto the haciendas or into the obrajes, the workshops, small factories, or into the mines to work. And those that can find work, and those that can't will simply have to die. That's what progress demands. It's sad, it's unfortunate, but necessary. That's the Cientificos perspective. And slowly but surely, over a few generations, they will cease to be Indios, and they will become mestizos. And there will be no more Indian problem in Mexico. And the beauty of this from the Cientifico point of view, all the money made from the sale of their one-time lands will be used to pay for all of the nice new things we need to construct to help to create our brand new Mexican middle class. And soon, once we've done all of this, we get a brand new, groovy Mexico. Yay! Go Team Mexico, right? This is their big idea. For the Cientificos, it was like mathematics, but of politics, finance, and people. Even though tremendous wealth was taken from the country in the form of raw materials, the income generated through employment in these extractive industries and from the sale of the lands and concessions primed the pump of the Mexican economy many times faster than would otherwise be possible without this foreign stimulus. In addition, foreign skills and assistance helped to develop a native industrial elite and improved infrastructure. All of this brought about within decades what might otherwise have taken a century or longer to achieve. To make this happen, sacrifices had to be made. The living conditions of the poor would be destroyed. The government would have to interfere with what they would have preferred to be a free capitalist marketplace, and there could be no true democratic government. Not yet. The Cientificos did not love or even admire Porfirio Diaz, but they saw him as a necessary evil, a dictatorial strongman to be tolerated until such a time as he was no longer needed. But the tragedy of the Cientificos is that they were too scientific. They could not really see the human factor in their social equations. For them, the poor people of Mexico had endured so much for so long that they would endure anything forever. And because they were university-educated elitists, the Cientificos, they could not fathom the notion that change could come, there's a typo there, sorry, from below. For them, it could only be directed from where they were and arranged, from above, with elegant, scientific logic and precision. In other words, they ignored the lessons of history, even their own, at their own peril. They just couldn't even remember, that just 50, 60 years earlier, 70 years earlier, that there had been an enormous mass uprising that brought about independence from Spain. That didn't come from the top. It came from below. They were just blind to all of that, all the lessons of history. You know, they were like a bunch of scientists in a laboratory trying to control all of the massive forces of all of the humanity of Mexico, like a bunch of puppet masters or guys playing a video game or something, you know. Ugh. Anyway, we're almost done here. The changes that were occurring in industrialized countries to improve the lives of workers had not made even a blip on the radar in Mexico. 12 to 13-hour workdays were like the norm. They were commonplace. No one had ever heard of a union. Sundays were not automatic days off. The notion of pensions or injury compensations would have seemed like fantasies. Strikes were broken up by the army, and agitators, labor organizers, anything like that, were thrown in jail. Mexican workers knew that in the United States wages were much higher, and that foreign employers in Mexico also paid much more. Worse still was the failure of the Cientificos to recognize what had happened in the agrarian sector. Literally, millions of families were without land or steady employment, and agriculture was the largest area of employment in the country. By 1910, it wasn't 10,000 families that owned the haciendas, it was 8,000. Even less people owned all the big land in the States by that point, accounting for over 50% of all arable land in the country. Most of their land was vacant and could have been farmed by the landless, as I made this point earlier, but I'm making it again to kind of wrap things up here. But they already made so much money, they could not be bothered to organize or manage the vacant lands to provide livings for their needy countrymen. And why? Laziness, or just simple lack of interest in their common man and in the well-being of their nation. And as the small middle-class Mexico did possess began to make sense of these states of affairs, rather than rally around the governing structure and the idea of the nation as it stood, as it existed, they became alienated from it. They became angry over the injustices of the very system that was trying to foster their growth and success. And slowly but surely, they began to turn against the regime of Diaz, and they began to first nibble and then bite at the very hand that fed them. And in 1910, as Porfirio Diaz approached his 80th birthday, powdering his skin with ground rice to disguise the truth of his Indian heritage, his grip on the reins of power, so tight and so sure for 3 decades, began to slip. The old macho was about to lose his dictatorship to the unlikeliest hero in all of the history of Mexico, a non-drinking, vegetarian, church-going, intellectually egg-headed spiritualist with a voice like Mickey Mouse. Okay, and we will talk about that guy, Francisco Madero, in the slideshare for Chapter 5. Or we won't talk about him. You're going to read all about him. I'm not going to be lecturing on him, but you're going to find out all about him in the slideshare in Chapter 5. Okay, so see you then, guys. Okay, talk soon.